Everyone. My name is Surya Dev. I'm a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this session by a panel of distinguished experts from different parts of the world, from different sectors, different organizations. And as you know, the theme of this session is inclusive workplaces. And I'm particularly interested in this issue because as a member of the UN Working Group, I wrote a gender guidance for the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which I developed after 2 years of consultation from 2017 to 2019. And this issue of diversity, inclusiveness, and human rights-based approaches to this agenda is very close to my heart. Now, I will not be taking too much of my time. Rather, I'm going to invite my panelists to share their experiences, their insights. And I'm also not going to introduce them, rather than invite them one by one to introduce themselves and share their personal story and why they are interested and what they have been doing about this issue of inclusive workplaces. So may I start, first of all, as the names are listed in the program, with Mr. Parmesh Shahani. So Parmesh, if you can introduce yourself and say some opening remarks. You have the floor now.
Thank you, Surya, and welcome to everyone who is here. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Parmesh. I'm the Vice President of Godrej Industries, and I'm also the author of this book called Queeristan, which has just come out. And for me, inclusion and LGBTQ inclusion in particular is very, very personal. As an out and proud Indian gay man, I wrote this book in a very particular format of memoir and manifesto to share my own journey with others in the corporate world, right? I gave my own journey at Godrej as well as that of so many other companies. And in the book, I'm showcasing not just companies and case studies, but also so many people who have benefited from inclusion. So the book has statistics, but it also has stories of real people who have been embraced by their organizations alongside easy steps and resources that anyone can do to start being inclusive right now. I really think that LGBTQ inclusion needs to be thought of as a win-win scenario, as in any other dimension of inclusion that we're going to hear about today. It's not an act of benevolence or something you do. It's really in the company's interest and advantage to be inclusive. In my book, I list 4 reasons to be LGBTQ inclusive: money, innovation, talent, and reputation. And I give a whole bunch of numbers, whether it's, the global LGBTQ economy being worth $5 trillion worldwide, or $200 billion being what the Indian LGBTQ economy could be worth. The cost of homophobia, according to World Bank study, of $32 billion, or the fact that being inclusive makes you 8 times more innovative, right? Employees are their innovation output is 8x that of non-inclusive companies. So all this is there along with incredible stories. But what I really want to say, before listening to so many of the other incredible panelists, is that being LGBTQ inclusive is very much a part of our Indian culture. We have a deep history and diversity with regard to what we call ourselves, with regard to how over hundreds of years and thousands of years we have been an inclusive society. So indeed, as I write in my book, what is non-Indian is homophobia. Homophobia is a Western construct. And, the British went away about 70 years ago. Now, finally, in 2018, 377 has gone away. And I think it's time we send this Western construct of homophobia also away. So since this is CII, the Confederation of Indian Industries, I urge everyone who is listening to actually embrace this inclusiveness, which is part of our Indian culture, and go on your journey towards inclusion. And in that journey, please, among many manifestations of inclusion, also embrace LGBTQ inclusion, which is what I'm very, very passionate about. So thank you so much for having me here. And thanks, Surya, for giving me a chance to do this.
Thank you, Parmesh, and thank you for bringing this personal touch to a very important issue and highlighting the historical connections. Next on my list, I would like to invite Ms. Ritu Bhatti. Ritu, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Satya. And, after that great introduction, I haven't written a book, I have been an HR professional for the past 20 plus years now, and inclusion has been very, very critical on my journey as a working mother. And I have two sons, one now starting to work himself, and one still in school. It's been a great journey to see how corporate India has actually embraced and benefited from this journey. And just to share a small experience from my past, I was leading diversity for one of the large organizations in India some 15, 20 years back. And at that point in time, work from home was a very, very alien concept. So I was like, the pioneer or the guinea pig, whichever way you look at it. And I started off with the dial up at home because, you didn't have broadband those days, and how you would connect through LAN, make sure that you were connected to the office and you were on a communicator in our organization at the same time, just to make sure that you were having those conversations. So, uh, with that, and a lot was kind of written about us in that organization, and we did a whole load. But I'm just sharing that that journey has kind of, grown so beautifully, and inclusion, as I see it, is just about empathy, being equal, and that needs a lot of culture change. And the minute everybody feels, and feels is the operative word, it's about perception. Feels included, feels equal, they feel like innovating, and that's what makes us successful. So culture is one big thing that an inclusive culture that I focus on. Of course, my role is very
I cannot see or hear Ritu anymore. Probably there's some internet issue. I can see Srila. Probably I will take this opportunity. Probably I'll bring in Ritu back later.
Okay.
And to save time, may I invite Sheila Das Gupta to introduce herself and say a few words to start the session from her side. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. Thank you, everybody at CII. It's always a pleasure to be on any panels that they have. So I'm Srila Das Gupta. I am currently globally leading the Disability and Neurodiversity unit for TCS. I am also the subject matter expert for diversity across all diversity segments. I have been with TCS for about 8 years now. For about 20 years prior to that, I was working in the not-for-profit sector, where I focused on human rights and social inclusion. My primary focus was on maternal health, which moved to reproductive and sexual health, which moved to HIV/AIDS rights, which moved to LGBT rights. And I worked for about 10 years in the villages of Rajasthan, Bihar, Jharkhand, and Himachal, and then kind of moved back to Delhi to really engage a lot with the government, uh, both through UN Women and through the Center for Policy Research and other such organizations. On a personal note, I developed an autoimmune disease and subsequently acquired mobility disability in 2005. And I am partially a wheelchair user or a crutch user. So remote working helps me, nobody knows. But that is probably when I started on the theory of disability inclusion, so to speak. But at the end of the day, the principles of inclusion are really the same. They don't change. So my move to the corporate world was really, I had been to the grassroots. So I had worked with community, I'd worked with the government, and I really wanted to work with this very large private sector, which I think engages with a very large community, and I wanted to be able to influence, or wanted to have be the facilitator to bring voices from the community to decision makers. In my opinion, inclusion really is the enabler so that every diverse person can bring their authentic selves to work, and that is the duty of all of us in the workplace, to create that enabling environment. Back to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Sheila. And these personal experiences, inspiring changes in the work culture is something very great to hear from all the panelists so far. Last but not least, I would like to invite Daniel Lee. Please introduce yourself, Daniel, and say some opening remarks. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. So I think my journey's quite personal. I grew up in almost a monoculture, if you like, in the southwest of the United Kingdom. So post-industrial, one of the highest poverty rates and unemployment rates in Europe. And racist, homophobic and sexist jokes were the norm of what we learned at school. I think personally, I've come a long way from there, but I know not everyone in my family has. And so the Black Lives Matter movement provided quite a nice time to actually have a look at my own biases and trying to raise my own awareness of privileges. And for me, the diversity and inclusion is much more with businesses. It's much more than about better decision making within business, but it's actually part of that broader fight to push back sort of centuries of discrimination and bias that have led to quite horrific outcomes, and to be part of a social transformation, which ties quite nicely to my work within the World Benchmarking Alliance, is to lead our social transformation work. We're a not-for-profit that benchmarks corporations on their contributions to the SDGs, and we look at that world through a lens of 7 systems transformations, with social at the core. And at the core of that is really respecting human rights, promoting equality, and empowering people. So it's quite a big, heavy focus of my work. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. So that concludes our first round of brief introductions and some personal stories connecting with inclusiveness and diversity. Ritu is also back now. Ritu, sorry that we lost you for a while, but I'm glad that I can see you again. So participants, now the session is going to be like this. I have some questions for all 4 panelists. So I'm going to ask these questions, and hopefully there will be time for some questions from you as well. So please feel free to add your questions and comments as we go along. And now I would like to start, in fact, Daniel, with you. You mentioned about the World Benchmark Alliance. And as we know, WBA has this list of 2,000 businesses all over the world. And there are 60 Indian companies as part of your list, which you regard as the most influential companies that can change or achieve SDGs going forward. So what would you expect these 60 Indian companies to do as leave no one behind? Daniel, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I think just to step back, and we say that in recognition of the SDGs, that inclusivity is a cornerstone within them, from their development through to the targets and that leave no one behind principle. I don't think we need to go into all of the individual SDGs or the targets, but I think maybe to focus on SDG 8 in terms of decent work for all, and decent work being work that respects the fundamental rights of workers, provides equality of opportunity and non-discriminatory workplaces. In terms of what the Indian companies should do, actually, I could be accused of being not that inclusive here, because actually, if inclusivity, so if diversity recognises the difference and inclusivity works with those, actually we can kind of take a step back and say that there is a universal standard that we would like to look at for companies, regardless of whether they're Indian or Chinese or American or European, which is their fundamental responsibility to respect human rights. And the UN Guiding Principles is that framework for the commitment to the human rights due diligence and the remedy process. That framework for respecting for human rights is the framework for me that underpins decent work, and therefore it's a starting point for positive contribution towards the SDGs. So where we are at the moment in terms of the work that we're doing is refining our methodology for all 2,000 companies, which has a respect for human rights at its core, and which builds on our corporate human rights benchmark work that we've done. will really push for that sort of non-discriminatory and enabling inclusive workplace piece for me. But in terms of the inclusiveness, a lot of that is the outcome, the final point, if you like. But for us, and what we found with our research previously on human rights, is that so many companies aren't putting in place the basics around respect for human rights. And so for me, the starting point is actually the UNGPs, for companies to build up on that towards their contribution to the SDGs and towards a more inclusive workplace.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for underlining the importance of UN guiding principles. That is the baseline. All businesses are expected to respect all human rights, and that's where the idea of equality and human dignity becomes very, very critical. Ritu, if I can now come back to you. Hopefully your internet is fine now. And my question to you would be that we have this COVID pandemic going on, and this has really created a disruption around the world. So how this agenda of inclusion and diversity assumes greater significance during this time, and any advice you have for companies going forward, how they should get ready for this crisis? Over to you.
Thank you, Satya. Yeah, thanks, Satya, for that. And yeah, I'm sorry, the electricity in my house decided to go away for a split second. So yeah, some drama, you see. So basically, COVID has just kind of brought digital disruption more to the fore. And we've been looking at digital disruption for a while now. And just to take you all back a little bit, if you look at from the year 2000, if you look at all the Fortune 500 companies, about 52% of those companies don't exist today. They were either taken over or they dissolved or they got acquired. So they don't really exist. Now, why is that? Because to exist, organizations need to keep innovating, and they need to keep innovating to survive, to stay ahead of the curve. They need to go to new markets. They need to create new experiences, etc., right? New services, new products. So innovation is the name of the game. Now, how do companies innovate, basically? Accenture did a study which kind of calls out that in order, the potential of innovation is immense. So, and they've calculated, we've put out there that the global GDP has a potential to grow, up to 8 trillion USD by 2028. If each country, and this is each country, if each country's innovation mindset increases by about 10%. And for India, that is huge because we are a huge company. Sorry, look at that. A huge country with a huge growing workforce. So that potential is immense. So innovation basically is the name of survival. Now, so let's correlate the two. Innovation is what is going to keep me there as an organization. And how will I bring about innovation? Innovation will come about if there is a culture in the workforce that is fostering equality, fostering inclusive behavior. People feel like they wanted there, they feel like they self to work, they don't have to be somebody different to be accepted at work, and then they will be able to innovate. And in 2018, Accenture conducted a study. We call it Getting to Equal, and we looked at about 18,000 people across 30 countries, organizations across these 30 countries. And of the 18,000, about 1,700 were leaders, business leaders, and about 1,500 were also people from the LGBTQ community. And what we found was that, all of them say that this feeling of being equal is very important for them to feel that they can contribute and that they belong to that place, and then innovation, the innovation index of the organization goes up. And just to give you an example or two, for example, in Accenture, and in Accenture, this is a core value. So we breathe as easy as, we say I&D is important. So it's reflected in everything. But just to call out a few things that we've been doing, we've been very successfully running a program called Career Reboot. This is for women who took a break from the workforce because of life events. And we know that women are primary caregivers across the globe, irrespective, of which culture you're talking about. So we launched this program to encourage them to come back to the workforce, where we would train them for 6 months, handhold them, give them mentors, etc., so that they can settle back in, gain that confidence that yes, I am contributing, I'm back in the workplace. Then for our own women who leave the workforce, take maternity leave, we have a very strong program called the Returning Mothers Program. And again, we have coaches, our own people who coach those who are taking maternity leave, how to come back to the workforce in a smooth manner, because there are a lot of pressures and there's a lot of stress that takes place that the women pick up. And for us, we're very happy that 95% of our mothers who come back stay on with us. So things like this that make sure that we are an inclusive workforce. And the minute Section 377 was repealed, we launched partner benefits, health benefits basically for partners in the LGBTQ community. So that sent that message out that we care, that it's important. So basically saying that, connecting the dots, yes, COVID has led to more digital disruption. Digital disruption needs innovation for organizations to survive. Innovation needs us to create a culture that treats everybody equally and people feel treated equally. And that's when we can innovate and stay successful. So that's what I want to share.
Thank you so much, Ritu, for making this connection between innovation and the need for equality, diversity, and inclusion. Now I would like to move on to Parmesh and talk about specific situations. Parmesh, I don't know if you can switch on your video. Very good, you're here. Okay, so Parmesh, I would like to ask you to talk about how the inclusion of LGBTIQ is critical for companies, and any barriers in your experience companies face, and how can we overcome those barriers? Over to you, Parmesh.
Yes, of course. But first of all, thank you, Ritu, for that. Love Accenture and all the work that it's doing, and cited it in my book as well. And really looking forward to speaking to all of you very, very soon. And I think, LGBTQ inclusion is really, really critical. Going back to some points made earlier about post-COVID world, right? Ritu was saying in terms of the innovation metrics, but even just by looking around, we're all wanting to enter this something called the new normal, whatever that might mean. It has to be a better version of how things were. It has to be a better normal. And one way of making it a better normal is ensuring that there are more people around the table which are representative of society outside. I think we've gone far too long where within businesses and companies at least, leaders, corporate organizations don't look like the society that exists outside. So I think part of the better normal really is about bringing diversity in all its manifestations within these workplaces so that we can recognize opportunities. So for maybe products or services that we might not be. So from various perspectives, right? I think COVID has given us a chance to reboot, reimagine, and co-create a more inclusive tomorrow. And I'm so excited to hear about, what Sheila is doing, what Ritu has been doing, what Daniel has been doing, because they're all fundamental, right? So to me, I think one of the big barriers that I get is ignorance. And that ignorance comes in two spaces, right? First barrier is always that there is always a person, and this person tends to be an older man, who anytime you bring up any idea for some new change, and Sheila is smiling, so I think maybe you've encountered this, but over time, you'll say, can we have maternity benefits? There will be this older man who will cough. Can we have LGBT rights? Can we have gender affirmation surgery? Can we include PWDs? There's always an older man who will, on the surface, say, yes, of course, but, and here it comes, let me play devil's advocate for a minute. And what that person will then do is then, showcase his fears and insecurities about how the status quo should remain, and go on to make sure that all your innovative ideas are kind of brushed aside again until the next meeting, right? So this is one of the big barriers. any good idea that comes in any meeting, there always, and without fail, tends to be one devil's advocate in that meeting who wants the status quo to continue. So I wish what I tell that person is, stop right there. The devil doesn't need any more advocates. The devil has enough advocates. Why don't you be an angel of change? Why don't you take on any other role? I'll give you like 5 roles that you can take, but this devil's advocate role is very bansi ghisa pita. There's no, I think this role is banished. So that's my one big barrier. And that comes largely from ignorance, because people are maintaining the status quo, are unsure of their place in this new tomorrow, whereas they don't realize that all of us who are asking for inclusion are not asking for the same little cake to be divided into more things. It's not like I will take a little part of your cake for LGBT and then you won't have it in, for straightness or PWD or anything. What we are saying is, let's bake a big cake and all eat nice big pieces of it, right? So that's the thing. So ignorance. The second is, a lot of people who want to bring about change don't realize that there's an entire ecosystem of enablers already there. For example, in LGBTQ, there are multiple job fairs taking place. There are startup initiatives like Periphery. If you want to hire trans people tomorrow, you can hire them. There are more and more companies that are becoming inclusive, following all the steps in the book, right? Right from basic policies all the way up to advocacy and all. There's a full ecosystem of providers. Mental health, name it. Over the past couple of years, we have created this ecosystem. So the other barriers, every company that wants to become inclusive thinks that they have to start reinventing the wheel all over again, and they waste so much time in doing this instead of tapping into the incredible network that exists of either service providers or community providers, etc., who will do the work for you. So these are my 2 barriers. I'm hoping now through this, through the wide reach of CII, we can overcome them.
Thank you so much, Parmesh, for highlighting the main barrier. And I think hopefully we can overcome that going forward by developing more sensitivity. So Sheila, if I can come to you now, the other dimension of inclusiveness is the persons with disabilities. So how crucial is their inclusion, and how we can bring in the intersectionality dimension to this agenda of diversity and inclusion? So if you can share your experiences and challenges and solutions in this regard.
I think inclusion of persons with disability would be equivalent to inclusion of any diverse segment, first and foremost. Because I am hoping that by now workplaces have stopped looking at them as recipients of sympathy and oh you poor things, and the link between skill sets and abilities to jobs is really the new facet of disability inclusion. One does not include because somebody has a disability. One includes because there is a skill match for a particular job that is there. Yes, there may be extra efforts made in reaching out to the right talent pool, but otherwise, that is essentially what I think is it is in a nutshell. I also want to say I find it very hilarious when people say that disability is the new gender, because I was part of the women's movement like in the late 1980s, and now one is looking at disability, which people are calling the new gender. But yes, probably the principles of inclusion and marginalization really are the same. What you brought up about intersectionality, I think, is very important, and that is what I want to touch upon a little bit, because I think there is a journey on the pathway to in inclusion. You start off with like a larger conceptual understanding and acceptance of the concept of a culture of inclusion by everybody. Accept that the fact that there will be very diverse colleagues working with you, and have a build segment-wise understanding where you deep dive into understanding the marginalizations vis-a-vis gender, marginalizations vis-a-vis LGBT vis-a-vis disability, race, ethnicity, so on and so forth. But then when you reach a certain diversity maturity index is when you start talking about intersectionalities. Because a woman with a disability will face greater social marginalizations and therefore employment marginalizations. Uh, Ironically, men with disability always do have spouses. Women with disability do not have spouses. So similarly, we did this whole series on cripping the pride, where persons with disability from the LGBT community came and spoke, and how they walk this very fine line because they are marginalized from actually both communities. So persons, when they are in their disability friend circle, they find it very difficult to talk about the fact that they're gay. And because their disability is so visible, it's something that cannot be avoided in their LGBT friend circle. And they feel friction and discomfort there. So these are very interesting areas of intersectionalities, which I think need to be explored far, far more. My basic thing is that diversity itself means heterogeneity, and it means therefore intersectionality. So you cannot have a homogeneous approach to something which is so innately heterogeneous.
I think it's really difficult to put it better than that. So thank you for that was a punchline. So great to end with that, Srila. I think we got an interesting question, and I would like you to, Srila, answer that question in the second round. But I want you to think about the question. The question is about that the COVID has created opportunities for people with disabilities. But this person assessed 266 websites, including of universities, and these websites are not accessible for persons with disabilities. So his basically question is that whether digital accessibility should be something that we need to look at. So I will come back to you later. But at this point of time, so you can think about this question. But at this point of time, I would like to
it's very close to my heart. I'm very glad somebody asked
Parmesh. So Parmesh, if you can turn on your video if possible, otherwise I'm fine. If we can hear you, that will also work. My question to you is that how do we create this culture of diversity and inclusion? And what role do you see for industry associations like CII? Over to you, Parmesh.
Sure. So I think what companies need to do is really be comprehensive and stop thinking of diversity and inclusion as, you know, a cherry on a cake or something nice to do. But it is the cake now. It is the cake in a post-COVID world. It is the cake that is going to enable you to survive and thrive. If you are not thinking about diversity and inclusion, I don't want to sound too morbid or dramatic, but I will. You will die because there's no way that you can live in this new world which is coming without being agile and without without having the inputs of a range of individuals, incredibly talented individuals who have been left out so far. There's no way you're going to survive. Other companies which will tap into these resources will come and they will eat your cake. They will take it away and you will die. So it's no longer the cherry on the cake, it's the cake, and hence you have to be completely comprehensive. You have to create a culture of inclusion at every level, not just put policies on paper. So for example, now through the work that we've been doing through this book, almost every company has LGBT inclusive policies, right? And that is everything: non-discrimination, same-sex partner benefits, gender affirmation, and so on. How you translate those policies into action is going to determine your success, right? Are you translating your policies into active hiring? Are you doing skill building? Because in so many cases with LGBTQ people, it's white collar and blue collar hiring. And you need a combination of going out to, say, MBA institutes, or high-end institutes, as well as skill building for people who might not have, completed the 10 standard and so on, but are very, very valuable at every level, of the talent pool, right? How do you do sensitization? How do you take your intent into action? So I think that is what you need to develop, and that is companies that do this well are going to survive and thrive. As Srila was saying, intersectionality is key between these different dimensions of inclusion to enable companies to understand the linkages between the two, right? What is the link between gender and the environment, right? Or between a Black Lives Matter movement, which is happening all around the world, and the anti-caste movement in India. If as companies you do not understand this, then your vision is going to be very, very limited. So I think organizations like CII can really play a vital role in pushing for change amongst their member companies, make them understand that it's not just gender, it's a range of pillars that you are being inclusive about. Showcase role models and case studies of companies who've done it right, to give confidence to the other member companies. Make sure that member companies understand the benefits of this inclusion. And I think CII should really act as an agent of change, pushing its member companies to embrace this as a win-win scenario for everyone. And I really look forward to the stewardship of CII that it does all of this in the years to come.
Thank you, Parmesh. And that's also a clear recommendation for CII and other organizations, how they can promote this idea of gender equality and all kinds of equality, so that we create not just a society, but also all the businesses which are thriving on this pillar of equality. All right, so now I would like to come back to Ritu, to you. And my question to you is that what about leadership commitment? Because one key issue that we keep hearing again and again is that we need leadership commitment to bring this change and bring the idea of equality and inclusiveness embedded into the organization. So if you can share your experiences about this leadership.
Thank you for that. And just a comment, I enjoyed listening into what Srila said about intersectionality and what Pramesh said, about, and also your question on somebody pinging on the side where how do they access jobs, and so many job sites don't have, they're not accessible to people. But I'll park that aside because there's a lot to say on leadership. Now, leadership is like, it's a cornerstone, and it's an accelerator to make any change happen in the organization. So it is a fact that if you have leadership commitment, that journey will go longer and it will bear fruit. Now, easier said than done, right? Because like Ramesh was saying, that there are those people who often say that I'm the devil's advocate. So there are those people. But to counter them, you do need a whole host of leaders who believe in the fact that this is the right thing to do, and right thing to do only not from a feel-good standpoint, because I think 20 years back we crossed that hill. From a commercial standpoint and from a survival standpoint, it is the right thing to do. And now, how does that happen? And I just want to add here that, we feel, and we did some, again, Accenture does a lot of work in this space. So one of our studies again told us that leaders, and in India and globally, and leaders in India, about 91% of those surveyed believe that inclusion is right on top. It's one of the biggest enablers that we have to make us successful and innovate. Globally, it was at 68%. So I was pleasantly surprised. I thought it would be almost as high, or India may not be as, as front and center as global, but it's the reverse. However, there's another thing we should know, that leaders, and this is our getting to equals study that we've done, and we keep increasing that numbers covered in that study every year. So that study told us that there's a difference in what the leaders feel they're doing. The leaders feel, as an example, one of the parameters I'm sharing, and there are a whole more, feel that I'm empowering. 76% of the leaders feel that they are empowering their people. Versus about half of that, about 42% of the employees feel that no, I'm not feeling empowered. I'm not feeling empowered to innovate or do anything with it. So yes, leadership buy-in, leadership drive is very, very important. And what are the aspects that will make this happen? There are three important things that will help make it happen. One is the environment has to be empowering, and the leaders create that environment, right? Then there has to be bold leadership. Someone has to stand up and say, yes, I believe in this. I'm willing to take this risk. This is something new. Let's try it out. That boldness has to be there. And I shared that example a minute back, right, on the section 6, 377, and then we put out those benefits for the community on health. So things like that, which are bold, then they tell the organization, they tell the teams working along that, yes, there is leadership buy-in. And finally, we need action to go with it. Only words will not get us anywhere. So a whole lot of initiatives and programs, whether it is training to build sensitivity, or it's training to make sure bias is not coming into your day-to-day working, or it's programs like returning mothers, or creating mentorship programs, or like we have internship programs for differently able people and LGBTQ communities, so that our workforce understands how we can be inclusive. What is the behavior I should exhibit and I shouldn't exhibit because it is not appropriate or it is sensitive, right? So a whole lot of action-oriented, stuff has to happen for it to come to life. And as a leader, some people may have the opportunity to do stuff very directly. Some others, whom we call culture makers, we call them culture makers or culture champions. Like my role may not be I&D lead, but I'm a leader, I lead a business. And if I'm a culture maker, I'm a culture changer, then everything I do and say is in that direction of creating an inclusive workforce. And so I will be living the values, I will be demonstrating the right behavior, I will be encouraging my teams to do that. And a lot of culture makers are required in an organization to make that change happen. And the last but not the least is the resource groups. They may not be leaders, but they are through the lines. They are champions who belong to that community, who understand what's happening there, and they are the ones we should work with along with the leaders to make that change actually happen. Because they are in between, they are on the ground, they are the leaders, they are in the middle layers, they are across, and they are making that change happen. So yes, leadership very important, and leadership buy-in is what makes us go to long, to go 9 yards.
Thank you very much, Ritu, for highlighting the role of action-oriented steps on the part of leadership. I think that is very welcome that you highlighted that. So Srila, I would like to come back to you and connect this question that I posed to you earlier about the digital accessibility of websites. I think that issue, and also any other remarks that you have that how COVID-19 has created this opportunity to better include persons with disabilities in the workplace. If you can briefly reflect on that, because we're running out of time, so I will appreciate it. Thank you.
So I'm going to try. COVID-19 has been good news and bad news for the world at large. But for disability, I think the good news is that you no longer, the necessity of having your physical self present in the workplace is no longer needed. So remote working has been a blessing. It does not matter if a person is unable to travel from one place to the workplace or not. So that is the good news. Now, something which I wouldn't really say is bad news, but something which we are getting there is that even like TCS is an IT company, and right from day one, we realized that as we are looking at digital access for everybody in remote working, we have to build in other aspects to ensure digital access for persons who are visually impaired, speech impaired, hearing impaired, because all our meetings are now, say, online, and for us to, for everybody to be able to engage. But there is a certain time period required. So I will go back to what Ritu said, is that there has to be an organizational commitment, a leadership commitment. Once you have that, and the money to kind of like a leader who's going to walk the talk, is then followed up by a certain amount of necessary technical gap which requires that access to happen. So if there are all these academic places which don't have it, it is important because by the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016, everybody can complain if it is not accessible. So please find out if it is something, if there is a commitment, the academic unit should be able to put it out and say that this is what we are working on. We will ensure that remote access is going to happen. If nothing of that sort is said, please talk to CII and say that they should raise it to the government right now.
Thank you, Sheila. And now I would like to go to Daniel finally, but there's also a question which I would like to read. That question is perhaps directed towards Parmesh. Parmesh, you may recall you took the older man as an example. So I think there is someone called Som Thomas who has posted a comment and a question that should we be targeting this so-called an older man, because then we are not really creating an inclusivity, because we are creating this conditional inclusivity. I think you are using that as an example, but I would come back to you to reflect very briefly in 30 seconds in response to that question. But before I give you the floor, I would like to go to Daniel. Daniel, can you hear me? Hopefully I can't see you, but hopefully you are with us. Yeah, okay, great. My question is that what role these benchmarks can play in bringing social transformations, because you are presenting World Benchmark Alliance. So what is the role of these benchmarks and ranking scales and businesses in this particular context? And any thoughts you have to guide businesses in future on this front? Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you. Firstly, it's part of a wider ecosystem, I think is worth reflecting on. So benchmarks are one little part of a broader approach in terms of market and non-market based mechanisms to try and improve company performance. The theory of change has been sort of borne out to a degree in practice when we've looked at some of the impacts that have been happening with these benchmarks. And they really are about making informed decision making. So a broad range of stakeholders who can use the information, whether it is consumers who can vote with their feet and use their money in different ways, whether it is investors who are engaged with the companies or voting or changing the way they approach their company engagement, whether it's governments in terms of regulation or the companies themselves. The idea is that, for part of it, we can harness the competitive nature of companies. So the leaders, that 20% that's out the leading edge, they do want to compete against each other. And this is something we have seen borne out, when we have the engagement where companies are fighting for 1 or 2 points, just compared to their peers. They don't necessarily care about everyone else. But also it's the ability to identify the laggards at the bottom end, the bottom 20%. And as we found with the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, those companies that just refuse to move, they're great adverts for raising the legislative baseline and supporting increased laws to create a level playing field. So there's a pulling from the top and there's a pushing from the bottom element of that. If we look ahead, we've got our first gender equality and empowerment benchmark coming out next year, which is quite small scale, focused on the apparel sector. And then we'll hopefully expand that out to more broadly across the 2,000 companies, and leaning on that methodology to inform a kind of a simpler methodology to link up towards the SDG ambitions on there. But I think once we have the data, it's actually the hard part then comes, which is mobilizing the stakeholders. Now, the Confederation of Indian Industries is one of the WBA's allies. So it's not an alliance so much of benchmarks as an alliance of organizations that want to use the benchmarks. And so we've got lots from the UN, from investors, from broad civil society, who will mobilize that action. And as an example, Aviva is one of the largest investment companies in the UK. I think they've got sort of $300 or $500 billion under management kind of thing. They changed their voting rules to say that if you were scoring below a certain percentage on the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, the director responsible would get automatically voted against re-election at the AGM. That kind of action we want to see, and driving that, hopefully, leadership from the top. I'd also say that our role is really important to engage with the companies themselves. So really keen for anyone from the Confederation who's interested to get in touch, because we will act as a critical friend to business. We have to recognise that for the SDGs we need to move the companies somehow by hook or by crook. And whether that's by a carrot or a stick, there are different ways, but that's what we're going to try and do.
Okay, Daniel. So I think that's a good message, outreach message for companies that you would like to partner with them as a critical friend to move on. We have about 10 minutes left, and I would also like to invite some other people who are listening to this panel session to ask us questions. There's some time for asking questions. I've already integrated 2 questions. And if you don't ask questions, I'm going to ask questions to these panelists in the remaining time. But Parmesh, if you want to very quickly react to the comment and question regarding your analogy of the older man.
So I have nothing against older men at all. In fact, many of them are my friends. Some of them are my parents, uncles, seniors at work, etc. I used it as an example, often also to talk largely about patriarchy and how that plays out. And it does play out in corporate boardrooms, as I'm sure you know, Surya, it plays out in institutions and other places as well, right? So I used it as an example to talk about why we really need to engage with people who try to be well-meaning advocates. They're really, what they're communicating to us really is that they're afraid of change and they don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But I think I get your message, but at the same time I also understand from where this question is coming, because the barriers to change could come even from a young person. It
Completely, yes, of course.
Coming from an old person, it could be also from a female. It could even come from an LGBTIQ. So it could be anyone.
Exactly. Yeah. Of course.
So I hope all the listeners will take the response in that spirit. That was merely an example, and it could be any one of us. And I think we should try to move the agenda forward towards achieving substantive equality. I don't see any further questions, but then I have a question. And probably I will go to Srila to begin with. Very quick, 60 seconds responses. All of you know fast fingers and all those games, right? So if you can be sharp, then we can perhaps take more responses. My question is very simple. If there is no leadership in any particular company, can we still do something about it? Can we do something bottom up if there is no leadership from the top? Srila?
Yes, absolutely. Because it just depends on how the voice is kind of put through. So the thing is that Ritu mentioned employee resource groups. So if one has a collective, one has a community. And at the end of the day, a company is nothing without its people. A company is not going to achieve its bottom line without its people. So if the employees come together, and I'm not even saying I work in a company which does not have unions, it's a white collar company, but that does not mean that somebody like a community's opinion is not held important. And leaders may not sometimes be aware of what the challenges are, but it is always important for us to engage with them and go to them and say that, listen, this is the problem. So, and I'm not saying that like a company will have a leader, a company will have a decision maker. So it is important for the company to, the community to go there and voice that opinion. The change can be bottom up at every point of time.
And I think everyone has to be part of the change, right? So it can't be merely leadership. So probably I will come to Ritu, to you now. I think several of you highlighted that there's a business case. Innovation is needed. That's why we need inclusiveness. So there are other arguments have been made earlier. There's a literature around the business case for diversity and inclusion. But if I keep wondering, if there's such a business case, why are we having this panel? Why do we, if there's a business case, why are companies not making more profit by having more inclusivity? Why are we discussing it? So what is it? So I am curious, Ritu, if you have a short response to that question.
I'll try and keep that short. So I think, many of us have talked about it. It's to do with change. Like, for example, and I'll give you a very small example. Work from home as a concept was something some companies did more, some did less. COVID has taught us globally that work from home is the only way to survive, at least in these COVID times, right? So it was something as drastic as nothing can move beyond this, that made everybody rally around, and organizations, government bodies, clients, everybody came together to make it possible, right? So many times we know the answer, but because we are so resistant to change, it takes something to shake us up, to make us, aware that yes, this is survival and that's it. So I think it's as simple as that. Simple. I'll give it back to you. I know you're short on time.
Thank you for that response. Pramesh, I have a question for you as well. And my question is that the title of this session has been Inclusive Workplaces, right? But what is a workplace? Is that changing in the 21st century, also because of the COVID? So are we talking about a workplace within the four walls of a home, or the workplace could also be public transport? Workplace could also be the cyber world. What is the workplace for you?
Yeah, the workplace is everything, and I mean, to me, these boundaries are also, certainly in a post-COVID work from home scenario, these boundaries have dissolved, right? So I think the workplace is everything. It's also even before a workplace, and which is why, I mean, in the book, I use this idea of family very strongly. I have a whole section where I talk about inclusive parenting and how for queer people in India, LGBTQ in people in India, parental acceptance means so much. When your family accepts you, you can literally move mountains, right? And I take this analogy and I take this framework into the workplace. And I say that for our workplaces, we need to act in loco parentis of our employees. We need to take care of our employees like they're our children and create scenarios in which they can really be empowered to be their best and to give their best. So I think inclusive workplaces are a flow of the inclusive society that we eventually want to live in and create, right? Where everyone is loved and respected and valued. So I don't see boundaries between educational institutions, workplaces, and societal structures like families, actually. I see them flowing.
Thank you, Pramesh, for that. Daniel, I would also have a quick question for you. So we often talk about, like, these issues about diversity and inclusion are within the portfolio of HR, human resources. But for me, HR also stands for human rights. So how do we connect with HR, which you typically relate in terms of human resources with human rights? Do we see enough rights-based language in HR, which is human resources, or HR avoid using human rights-based languages? Any reflections based on your engagement with companies?
Yeah, I think it's a broader issue than just the inclusion piece. Actually, it's the lack of broad understanding of human rights across the business agendas. So I used to be a consultant working in the space, and we chat to companies and they say, well, that's health and safety. That's not a human rights issue. I'm like, I'm pretty sure it is. Or we talk about all these different issues that people wouldn't understand through the lens of human rights. And it comes back to that, and actually tying into that leadership piece before, of reframing the way that we understand things inside business, or at least making clear the articulation that actually an inclusive workforce, as we said earlier, is not a nice to have. It's fundamentally respecting people's rights that we've established through a very long period, that this is what people are entitled to have, and the companies, if they don't provide that, should be actively working to enable it. So I think, yes, it's a definite gap, but we have to also recognize sometimes that there are, with the gap in the knowledge, it's no good to just come in and say, you should change, you should do this better. We have to meet people a certain degree to where they are and bring them on, because a lot of people run for the hills when you talk about human rights. They get scared of it. They think it's going to cause lots of trouble, or they just bring in the lawyers and automatically fight back. So we have to be cognizant of that.
All right. So we got one more question. This question is from Sangeeta Robinson. And that question, perhaps I will throw to Srila and Pramesh also, if you want to jump in. The question is that the RPWD Act has been in force since 2016. So the Act gives equal rights to LGBTI, but we do not see any changes. So how do we move this needle and make the difference? Very briefly, Sheila, 30 seconds, Pramesh, 30 seconds each.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I think there are two parts to this question.
Two parts, yes.
Yeah, RPWD Act does give rights.
That's why I'm throwing the question to both of you. 30 seconds each. You can pick your part.
Okay, so yes, there are certain things which are in motion. A lot of the companies have taken it up. There is a disability policy aligned to the law and actions have been taken up as per the law guidelines. Some companies may not have done that, but the thing is that, as we mentioned in the previous section, all of us within the company are potential change makers. If you feel that your company does not have a disability policy, just talk about it. Make sure that it happens. It is your right to make it happen.
Good. That's very powerful message. Parmesh, 30 seconds because we're almost over there.
So I didn't really understand that
The
in terms
question
of
is, how do we make the change about LGBTI rights? Because that is not happening. Enough speed is not there. How do we move the needle?
Oh, of course, completely by linking LGBTQ inclusion to other aspects, right? And recognizing, I mean, I think the argument that I've also used in the book is both a business case as well as an emotional case, right? Recognizing that if 4 to 10% of your population is queer, but personalizing it, thinking, what if your family, you know, I mean, so I use many arguments in the book to like deeply connect it at an emotional level. But my most fundamental thing, and I think which connects most with people, is it is in our culture to include. How can we how can we claim to be inclusive and Indian when we're willfully excluding so many people from, you know, an imagination, actual jobs, benefits, and so on. So there's many frameworks you can use.
Your approach is to throw everything, and hopefully one argument will stick. Okay.
But not just throw everything, because everything it is about everything, right?
Of course. All right. So we have now taken all the time allocated for this session. So let me thank all the panelists and all the participants for sharing their views on this particular topic.